Hello and welcome to what is actually my very first video. In this video, I want to share my experience learning Japanese and more specifically, how I passed the Japanese language proficiency test, the JLPT N1 level, which is the most advanced level, without ever directly studying for it. So I hope this video will be useful for people thinking about learning Japanese, or for people that are learning Japanese but are struggling with motivation, for example, or for people that already learn Japanese but they are just interested in knowing other people's stories. And before I start, just a brief introduction about myself. My name is Pedro and I'm Brazilian. I started learning Japanese in 2009, around April I think, and I took and passed the JLPT in December 2012. Moved to Japan in 2013 and I have been living here ever since. At the start of my journey in 2009, I did what most people do when they start learning a different language, which is taking classes. So I started taking Japanese classes, and the milestones that are usually set for you when you take classes are usually something like to pass an exam. So for Japanese, that usually means passing the JLPT N5 when you're a beginner. And as a result, usually what you study are vocabulary related to the N5 exam, or you start learning kanji that will be required to pass that exam, and so on. And I was okay with that in the beginning, but very early in my Japanese learning journey, I realized that I wanted something more, and I started to try to visualize what it would mean to be successful in learning Japanese. Like, what level do I want to be at? There would always be this image in my head, which would be that of me speaking perfect Japanese while talking on the phone. Like, for example, hanging out with friends, and then suddenly my phone rings, and I just go like, oh, hold on a second, I gotta take this call. Moshi moshi. And then I just start to speak as if it was the most natural thing in the world for me. And then I realized that if I just kept taking those classes, it would take me forever to achieve those goals. Don't get me wrong, I actually think those classes were great. That's where I took my first steps with Japanese. That's where I learned hiragana, that's where I learned katakana. That's where I learned the basic structure of Japanese sentences. So it's not like it was a total waste of time. Not at all. But anyway, after that, I decided to shift my focus from learning Japanese to pass the N5 to being able to speak Japanese. And of course, if I wanted to be able to speak Japanese, I would need to be able to read in Japanese, listen in Japanese, and even write Japanese before being able to speak Japanese, because speaking is generally the last skill you acquire in a language. Now I want to talk more specifically of what I did in this 3-year frame of 2009 to 2012. The first thing I did, or I should say second thing I did, because the first thing I actually did was quitting those Japanese classes, was to study kanji. And to study kanji, I used the famous book by James Hayzick, the Remembering the Kanji. Many viewers probably have heard about that before. Then for grammar, I studied using a guide to Japanese grammar by Tae Kim, and I think is the only guide to Japanese grammar that you ever need, so I'll leave the link in the description for that. And then I started learning Japanese sentences using this material called Kanji Odyssey, which I'm not sure if it's still available or not, but it's made of sentences that have audio in them. They cover the most important readings for the most 95% commonly used kanji, if I remember correctly, something like that. But not only I followed this more structured approach to learning, but I also did other things that I wanted to do in Japanese in the first place. For example, I've listened to a lot of Japanese music, which is something I have loved since 2009. I've also watched a bunch of dramas, which is something I was really into at that time. And of course, I also watched anime, and I loved playing games. What the language community usually refers to as immersion. Although for me, it was more like a semi-immersion, because I was a university student at the time. I had a busy schedule and I didn't have time to just study Japanese all day. I've also used the spaced repetition system to remember what I learned, more specifically the very famous Anki. What I usually did at the time was to add sentences containing vocabulary that caught my interest at the time, and even from the start I tried going all Japanese. I would add a Japanese sentence and then the definition would also be in Japanese, but that didn't work so well because especially when you're still in the beginner or maybe intermediate level, you know, the definition will also have a lot of vocabulary that you don't understand or structures that you don't understand. So then you look for a definition within the definition, and then you look for the definition within the definition of the definition, and that goes on forever. So I shifted to using definitions in English as well, and I think that went much better until I was ready to go full Japanese. And then in 2011, November 2011, I went to Japan for the first time, although as a tourist, and I think my Japanese at that time was actually pretty great. I could have whole conversations in my mind in Japanese already. But when I actually went to Japan, I realized it was not that easy. It was very, very difficult for me to talk to people, in part because I'm kind of a shy person, so I was too embarrassed to speak. I was too embarrassed to make mistakes in front of native speakers. I was totally paralyzed. I couldn't speak out, I couldn't say anything. But I was in love with the country. I have decided that I wanted to move there somehow. And then the next year, 2012, I decided to try the Max Scholarship. If anyone watching the video doesn't know what the Max Scholarship is, it's a scholarship provided by the Japanese government, so if you're interested, check that out. Anyway, I applied for that scholarship to do my graduate studies in Japan, and I was approved. By the way, this is a piece of advice for people that want to try the Max Scholarship. Knowing Japanese beforehand actually helps. Definitely helped me leave a better impression in the people working at the consulate where I applied. But anyway, it was already decided that I would be going to Japan in April 2013, and I took the JLPT N1 kind of as a sort of preparation before going to Japan. Now, being honest with you, I studied for the exam once. 1 week before the test, I checked a mock exam online just to know the flow of the exam, so that I wouldn't go there without knowing absolutely nothing of how it works. But I can say that I was 100% confident that I would pass the JLPT. I'm not saying this to brag or anything, I'm just saying this to show that I really believe that what I did in these 3 years was very effective to help me learn Japanese. To finish this video, I want to summarize 3 pieces of advice that I share based on my own experience. So advice number 1, reevaluate your goals. Think about why you want to learn Japanese, and also think about how far you want to learn Japanese. Do you want to learn Japanese to be able to watch anime without subtitles? Or if someone calls you from Japan right now, you want to be able to answer in perfect Japanese? Reevaluate your goals, because that will determine the actions that you take to achieve that goal. Advice number 2 is to learn at your own level, but to not limit yourself. With your why you want to learn Japanese and how far you want to learn Japanese in mind, you don't have to wait. For example, if you want to be able to watch anime in Japanese, then watch a bunch of anime. If you want to be able to understand Japanese conversations, then you can listen to the news, for example. Or if you're interested in Japanese literature, then try to read a bunch of books. It'll be hard in the beginning, it will probably make you want to cry, but it will totally be worth in the long run. And then advice number 3, which I think is actually the most important, is to make things simple. So Japanese is already way too complicated. You already have to learn 2 new alphabets, the hiragana and katakana. You have to learn thousands of characters. What I did to remember what I learned, as I said before, was using Anki. But it's too easy to get totally carried away with Anki, and then you end up using all your hours just on Anki. You don't want that. Even back in 2009, when I was starting, there were lots of fancy things that you could do with Anki. For example, you could extract hundreds and hundreds of cards from a single episode of a drama with audio in them and all of that. But I found that just adding the sentences by myself, you don't even need to add everything you learn, just some sentences that resonate with you was more than enough. In the front part of the card, I added the sentence that I wanted to learn, with the vocabulary that I wanted to learn, the structure that I wanted to learn, and then in the back part of the card, I added the definition of the vocabulary that I was studying. And that's it. You don't actually need to do anything else. Just add the words that you think are interesting, and that's enough, because you don't need to worry so much if the vocabulary you are adding is important or not, because what is important will appear again and again, and you will get a feel of what's important in the end. Well, these 3 pieces of advice are based on my experience. Well, when I was learning, I tried a lot of things. In Japanese, what we call shikousakugo. It's basically trial and error, right? Some things worked, some things didn't work. But I think these 3 points of advice are the key points that allowed me to pass the JLPT N1 without ever studying for the JLPT N1, like vocabulary tests, kanji, blitz, or whatever, in 3 years. This is the end of the video. Feedback and comments are very much appreciated. In my next video, I want to talk about why I learned kanji before learning any other aspect of Japanese, and of course, also how I did that. And in future videos, I also want to talk about Japanese literature. If it's something that you may be interested in, subscribe and see you in the next video. Bye bye.